Well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining what we're calling the Constellation conversations here, which is a venture of Fireside Adoptees, Constellation and Legislation Group, and also Unraveling Adoption and APtitude. We're excited to have a really great panel here tonight to answer some questions about different perspectives that are current in the adoption constellation. We'd like to give precedence to and favor to the adoptee voice in this. And the reason for that is, of course, that for many years, I myself as an adoptee and other adoptees, we've struggled to have a voice as adult adoptees in conversations. A lot of our agency has been stripped away. And sometimes there are very important discussions that happen in public discourse and in policy making that we haven't been included in. So it is part of an uphill climb for us, but we're finally finding our voice as adult adoptees. So you'll often hear me selecting Linda Pevac, our adoptee, as the first speaker in each of these question groups here. And that's the reason for that. It doesn't diminish at all the experience of our birth mother, Yvonne Rivers, or our adoptive parent, Beth Syverson here. It's simply the respect that we believe as adoptees, after having taken a long time to finally get a seat at the table, that it's important for us to have those voices expressed. So we appreciate your understanding of that here. So this will be basically a multi-part discussion here, where I will break this up into three parts. We'll first start with introductions and then three main parts. A discussion about what each of the members of different communities here is observing within their respective community, which would be the adopted community, the first parents or the birth mother community, and the adoptive parent community. And a second section that I'll call Constellation Dialogue. We'll talk more in general about ways that the constellation itself can be more effective in terms of communication. And then the third part is more about public conversations in terms of socially, what is it that people in society, we think they should know about adoption as a topic? What are the things maybe that people are unclear of or would have no idea about? So at the conclusion of that, we'll continue on with a Q&A session. It will not be part of this recording here, but the intent there is, of course, to allow each of the panelists to answer questions from the audience. Again, we certainly appreciate your participation here and your patience. So we'll start here with some introductions. I'd like to first tell you again the names of the members of the panel here. Linda Pevac is an adoptee. Yvonne Rivers is a birth mother. Beth Syverson is an adoptive parent. And I'm Greg Gentry. I'm also a domestic adoptee from what's called the baby scoop era, born in 1969. I do, of course, bring the perspective of an adoptee to this, but this isn't really about my input as much as it is to moderate the panel and give the people on the panel a chance to share about these communities that we're in. So let me begin by having Linda introduce herself and speak a little bit also about the work you do in your specific sphere. Welcome, Linda.
Sure. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, everyone that has made time for tonight to come here and have this important conversation. I am an adoptee from the baby scoop era myself, and domestic, same race. I had an adoptive brother, and it was a situation of where I wasn't given the space or the freedom to be myself. And so fast forward to being an adult, that's why Emma Stevens is my pseudonym. And I wrote 2 books to have a voice. And I felt like I needed to take that drastic measure in order to help myself and also help my community of adoptees. So I wrote The Gathering Place, and most recently would be A Fire is Coming. And I'm very happy. I think everyone should be able to tell their story, and each person that we get to talk to, we get to help. And the more we talk, like conversations like we are tonight, the better off we're going to be, and give each other freedom and space to be the best we can be.
Thanks so much, Linda. We'll move over to Yvonne Rivers, our birth mom. Would you like to introduce yourself and also talk maybe a little bit about Birth Moms Real Talk?
Absolutely. Thank you, Greg, Linda, everyone who's here. You're taking the time. This is a conversation that needs to happen all the time, all the time. I am Yvonne Rivers. I am a birth mom. as well as the host of Birth Moms Real Talk podcast. And that platform was created, really be going on our third year, to give a platform for birth mothers to tell their story, which likewise adoptees need to have a voice there too. And I'm an advocate for adoptees. Just as you said, Greg, is that adoptees didn't have a voice when the adults were making decisions. And that's really so impactful and pertinent. And through the podcast of the many years of her third year, I think we're down up to like 45,000 downloads. I get and I hear from adoptees and saying, this is them listening in to the perspective of a birth mom. So as a birth mom, and I found my son in reunion after 45 years. So just imagine that. And believe you me, it was many years of searching, but I kept believing because that was in the close era. It was 1973 that I placed my son. So for 45 years of finding him. Now, the journey began in the reunion. So the past 5 years has been the journey that we're writing the playbook of how to do this, because there's nothing that tells us ABC 1, 2, 3. And you really have to have and come to that. So we'll talk more later about For's perspective and having this open dialogue, because the mission of Birth Moms Real Talk podcast is to open the story, take the covers off of this secrecy, this all these things that people, and I say they said that birth moms and adoptees wanted when we didn't say. So it's a whole lot of things we're going to uncover tonight. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. And Beth Syverson, our adoptive parent, who is the host of Unraveling Adoption, who's hosting the platform right now for us, and also APtitude. Would you like to introduce yourself, Beth?
Thank you. Yes, sure. Thanks, Greg. And it's great to be here on the panel with Linda and Yvonne. And Amanda Baums from Fireside is also helping produce this event and is doing behind the scenes work. So thank you all. And thank you all for being here. You know, there's a million things you could be doing on a Saturday night, and you're doing this and talking about the challenges of adoption. So I'm grateful you're here. And I adopted my son from Japan when he was 7 months old. He's now 19. And I want to say right up at the front that my son gives me explicit permission to talk about our family story. I'll try to mostly talk about my own perspective, but I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my son. So he will occasionally come into the conversation, but he's actually been invited to come. I don't know, he might show up tonight. I'm not sure. He's 19. He probably has better things to do on a Saturday. But our story in brief is everything was perfectly fine. He was just a charming young man, like super perfect, until he reached adolescence and then sort of, you know, took off that mask of perfection. And he struggled with addiction and some serious mental health issues since about, we think, 13, and he's now 19. So we're still struggling, but it's he's working really hard, and we're trying some new things. And it was his idea to create a podcast, and actually we're almost exactly on our 2-year anniversary of that being our first episode rolling out. So he's not always on the podcast anymore. It's mostly just me now, but he is very much behind helping other members of the Constellation, and particularly the public, understand adoption and addiction and mental health better. So Joey is here with us in spirit, and he wants our story to help other people. And I am also, like Yvonne said, definitely an ally for adoptees as much as I possibly can. My whole world now revolves around what can I do to help adoptive parents be better, to help them understand this thing better, and to get the word out to, you know, doctors and therapists and the world better. So that's my real heart, is to help people like my son. So that's why I'm here.
Great. Thanks so much, Beth. Thanks to everyone on the panel for really great shares. And the intent, of course, in addition to the introduction of each person, is to say that there's work being done by everyone on the panel in terms of the adoption constellation. There are allyships, there are advocacy things taking place. And the intent, of course, is not in this discussion to advocate certain positions. Like, we're not going to come out and say we're against this or we're for that, or try to persuade people in certain directions. We respect the individual decisions of people, but we do hope to bring perspectives here about what's going on in each of our groups. and collectively and understanding, hopefully, that will broaden some awareness of what's happening. So again, very much appreciate everyone in the panel and also everyone participating. And Amanda Baum, thank you for reminding me about Amanda Baum. She is the founder of Fireside Adoptees and an invaluable member of the adoptee community, and also in the Constellation, and has a real heart for reaching a lot of people. And so we appreciate her as well. So I think with this in mind here, we'll go into the first section here. Now, it's important to know that we have to speak in generalities in a way here, because of course, if we specifically just focused on each individual story, those are incredibly important. But we're hoping that for each of us who happens to be in a respective community, that there are maybe collective experiences that we've had of members in that community, and like almost, I'm going to call it like a barometer reading or a pulse, finger on a pulse of what's going on in these specific communities, sub-communities of the adoption constellation. So I'd like to start with Linda, and the question really is this: as an adoptee, and I know you're in a lot of adoptee spaces, and many of us are in there with you. If you were to describe collectively kind of what you see in terms of adoptees and their journeys, the adoptees that you interact with, do you see any certain things that give you an overall sense of what adoptees are experiencing?
Sure. I think that a lot of adoptees that I've talked to are just like myself, when we thought we were the only ones when we were growing up, and we thought we must be crazy. But because thank you, technology, and actually pandemic, it's when it really surged, that everyone got on Zoom and everyone got to know each other and realized there's a huge community out there. And now we've expanded to donor conceived and late discovery and misattributed parenting, and all of the commonalities it seems like there's a groundswell. And to me, it seems really exciting, because I feel like what we're doing right now, just like what Nancy Verrier and others at that time did for us, we benefited from. And now the people that are coming up behind us maybe won't have to go through these things, because there's going to just be the information and the education and the research and really the science behind the whole thing. So it's exciting to me to see what's happening, and I'm so happy to be free and have the space to help my community in any way I want.
Thank you. And groundswell is the word I happen to use for it as well. I think that's very accurate. And you can feel it building. You can feel it. It's even in the couple of years I've been in it, I experienced that as well. So I appreciate your perspective. Thanks so much, Linda. So I'll bring the question to Yvonne, specifically about birth mothers and first parents. Is there like a collective pulse or something that's going on in the community that you would say describes what's going on there?
Well, the collective response or impact on birth and first mothers and parents is that disenfranchised grief that's been buried so long. When you talk about the baby school, or you're talking about in the 60s or whatever. So you're talking about 40, 50 years. For me, it was 45 years of finding my son. But even for the time of having and giving birth, and birth moms and first moms are at different places and stages in their life, because I talk to a lot of them and in different spaces and so forth. And some are just peeking their head out of for air. And I say for air because they really want to get deep and get through this grief that they have. And I don't know whether a lot of them have that word of grief. It's pain. It's pain. It is pain. It is pain that you're going through, because our children are part of us. My son was with me for 9 months and 12 days. There's no forgetting that. But that's what we heard. Oh, forget it. You forget about them. You move on. They were just lying. And they just didn't have that perspective. So someone had asked me the other day, how do you negate the negative things and think the positive? You have to turn off those negative things. And unfortunately, most birth moms, when you're going through a situation, crisis that you're not able to, and I speak for myself, I simply weren't able at that time to care for my son. That's why he was placed. Wasn't because I didn't want him, wasn't because I didn't love him. And then you have the scenario that people will think, well, if you place your child or whether you didn't love him or whatever. Completely false. So it's a lot of situations out there in society will have that idea. They also had a societal stereotype. Well, you must have been sleeping around and whatever and so forth. And it's just a simple thing of that time of not being married and being pregnant made it such a sin and everything else that you just need to be banished. And a lot of birth moms, if you listen to the podcast, some will go up to the attic, will go down to the basement. You couldn't even be seen. Couldn't even be seen. And then when you're sent away, and some were sent away because some had the stories, well, they sent me to Europe, they sent me to an aunt. Well, I really was in South Florida, where you really are in a birth mother's home. That wasn't offered or opportunity for me in 1973 because of segregation. I am a woman of color, in case you can see, live and full color with that. So my scenario was different. I'm in my home, but still being ignored. And when I come out and tell my parents, really being in a dysfunctional family, even before I became pregnant with my son, so not being acknowledged and so forth. So that grief and trauma is through the whole triad. So birth and first moms, they're at different spaces based on what they have endeavored to do for themselves, to do their own work, to get their therapy and whatever, because that's really indicative of how they'll be receptive to their child if and when they find them. Because that's a question that adoptees will ask me. Well, they may have found their parent, they may not want to have a relationship with them, and they'll ask me why. And I said, I can't answer for your mother, but I probably believe is that grief and trauma is buried so deep, she simply can't at this time. May want to, but simply can't. So it's a varying ranges of the birth and first moms, and it's based on how they're perceiving it, how they're pulling themselves up. Because a lot of the moms come on the podcast, it's the first time they've ever told anyone. And some of them have aliases because the family still don't know, but they're willing to come on a podcast under a different name, or maybe this is their coming out. I'm going to do the podcast. This is my coming out to my family.
Very powerful. Thank you. That was really illuminating for me. Thanks so much, Yvonne. So Beth, that in the adoptive parents community, what is the pulse reading you would give?
Yeah, there's a lot of pain in the adoptive parent community as well. I think that might be a theme here among the triad. I would never want to compare it to the pain of adoptee, because I think that is, next level, because most adoptees were children when this happened to them and they had no agency and so on. But there's a lot of unresolved pain and grief that adoptive parents are dealing with. They may or may not know they're dealing with it, but it comes out. And many of us, like myself, came into adoption through infertility. And that is a major loss that, when is not, dealt with in therapy and some deep, deep work, you're going to be carrying that grief with you and informing everything you do as a parent. So a lot of us are in deep pain, and from infertility or from miscarriage or from whatever, made us choose adoption. It's not usually the first choice. So whatever we lost that didn't turn out the way we thought it would, we kind of soldier on and just like, okay, this will be just fine. And that's what I did at first. I was like, okay, well, we're going to make the best out of this. And I love him. I love my son from the minute I saw a picture of him. And I still have this grief on top of it. So it's an extra layer that a lot of adoptive parents are not even willing to talk about. I'm sure all of you probably have heard of the fog and coming out of the fog. Well, adoptive parents need to come out of the fog too. It's not just the adoptees coming out, it's the adoptive parents that are going, oh, I came out of the fog when a dear friend of mine, well, she wasn't that, she was a friend of mine, but not a dear friend, but now she's a dear friend. But she said, when Joey was having trouble, deep crisis trouble, she says, Beth, isn't Joey adopted? And I'm like, well, yeah, what does that have to do with anything? I was like, there was such a huge disconnect. I had no idea. And I was a pretty quick study though. She says, go read The Primal Wound, go get this adoption therapist. And I did. And I went, oh shit. um, what do I do now? So now, I did a deep dive. I'm continually reading and talking to people, and now I'm trying to help other adoptive parents to, come out of the fog as gracefully as possible so they can be better able to help their kids.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for the answers to that question. And again, we're speaking in, of course, the best we can do here is generalities, because we're representing communities of people, and and it's important to be able to abstract a bit and speak in those terms, so that it's a useful way of kind of gauging how things are going in our respective areas here. It leads to another question, and again, we're not trying to advocate for, we want to do away with this, or we want this to be our position on something here, but there are, I think, within each of these communities, possibly areas where each of our members maybe thinks, I wish something was different in here. I wish something could be changed in here. So I wanted to start with Linda and say that, are there changes you would like to see within the adoptee community?
Well, I think the first thing that popped in my head was, I really wish that what I'm seeing lately about adoptees attacking other adoptees is really disheartening, and it's only going to serve to pull us back in all of our advancement. And so I'm hoping that the more we remain open and willing to learn from every aspect and come out of the fog on a lot of different issues, that we might have a better chance to really create change. Change is always hard. People resist change. We've always done it this way. It's, a lot of people just they get addicted to their own way of thinking, and they don't see any reason to change. So I guess I would just hope that, we just lean in to each other and try, even though it's triggering, even though it may be uncomfortable, but just keep open minds and keep the talks going.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I agree. And it is very disheartening to see that happen. And it happens among people we love in the adoptee community too, unfortunately. And it's part of our trauma, and it does require work and an openness. So thank you for that. I'd like to ask Yvonne the same question about first mothers or first parents as a community. Are there things you would like to see that maybe could be changed, or something that would be beneficial, you think?
Well, I'm not suggesting that the community itself will change, but I would say, and I use the word expectations, that I say this in all the rooms I am with birth and first moms, is in your expectation with your relationship with your child, whether you found them or not, your expectation with your family itself or with other birth or first moms, is recognizing that all of us come to this community from our own background and environment. And we have to be, and I use this word, have grace and healing for yourself and for others. And how you do that is not set your expectation on someone else, not set your expectation on your child, not set your expectation on what you expect other people to do, but we have to be very clear and honest. And my newest acronym is HOT, H-O-T, honest, open, and transparent. With ourselves first, then with others. And if you're there, then people can not only, I don't want to say respect you, but know you're coming from a place of grace, healing, and love. If we show that to each other, that's it. Because I always say, put yourself in someone else's shoes. I hear the virtual communities or whatever with adoptees or whatever else. I myself have experienced is like expectations of what they perceive me to be. And I think I've been kicked out of a community, but you know what? I'm so okay with that. But along with it, of having the expectations of others, just because you may think, and that's really what I say, is that a lot of times with birth for first mothers or natural mothers, or whatever name you go by, let me just talk about that. Because if you prefer one particular title, just say that. And that's okay. and no one can make you go by the others. Well, I think, well, okay, that's fine. I respect you and whatever title you want to go by, and I respect that. But along with it, with the expectations of whether reunion, how come I haven't found my child, or how come my child don't respond? Well, I sent a text, they don't respond. Expectations, y'all. I mean, really, don't go off the deep end, because I say your child, that birth bond will never be broken. My son was raised by his mother. His mother raised him. I gave birth to him. And how I say, I gave him life. She taught him how to live life. So we have to understand, we have to really work together. And it's that nature and nurture that works together. That's what makes us who we are. Whether we grew up in our family with not as a non-adoptee or not, we are really governed by what the environment we're in. And take the high road, take that focus road, take that love road, but have the expectations of your own, but don't put them on others. Do not put them on others, because you're doing the same. When I'm talking to birth of first mom, you're doing the same thing that was done to us years ago. Go away, you forget about it or whatever. That's what they thought. And I use the word they, and I always say, who is they? I'm not listening to they. I listen, and I know my name, and it's not shame. So I stand up boldly and proudly to know who I am. I came from a dysfunctional family, so if you listen to my podcast, you'll know I came and told my mom and my father separately I'm pregnant. I got the blank stares and a blank wall. But just because they wouldn't talk to me, I kept talking. Didn't care whether they'd listen to me or not. But along with it, that was my reason of placing my son. And I make this statement, and I'll say this to birth and natural moms, is the fact that I don't say I couldn't raise my son. That was because I couldn't raise my son, that he was placed, but he was always and still my responsibility. God gave him to me to raise and to grow. And I tell him all the time, he's my greatest creation, because I never had other children after him. So expect what you expect for yourself, but don't put it on anyone else. Own your own reasons and your own purpose.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yvonne. It's very powerful. About Beth, are there areas in the adoptive parents community you would like to see changed? I'm kind of going to laugh a little bit at that, because I think you've kind of said this already, but I'd like to give you a chance to speak about it again.
Yeah, I think I wish when my son was young, or before I adopted him, I wish I had known way more than I did about adoption. I don't know. I didn't adopt through a big agency. It was just kind of like a private thing in Japan. It was very different from many other places, but they certainly didn't tell me anything. And I didn't find this material until, like I said, my son was in crisis. So man, I wish people that are adopting or that have adopted would find resources much sooner than I did. And that's what I'm trying to provide with things like this, with the podcast, Unraveling Adoption podcast, and with our APtitude support group for adoptive parents. By the way, Wendy and Susan are here from APtitude. Woo! Thank you for being here. And I know there's a couple other adoptive parents here too. So, it's not easy to step into these rooms as an adoptive mom. There's a lot of guilt. God knows I have so much guilt. That's the way I assuage my guilt, is to do action and to make a difference going forward, because I cannot go backwards and fix anything I did. I didn't know. And so I have to give some self-compassion to myself and others that just didn't know. Now, if I have people telling me and I'm still saying it doesn't matter, my child's a blank slate, I get to do whatever I want with them, well, then that's a whole separate thing. But I don't run into those parents. I run into the parents that literally just have not been made aware of the complications and challenges that adoptees have. So that's a big mission of mine, is to get more adoptive parents on board. I kind of am in those, I'm in a bunch of adoptive parent groups. Some are more kind of progressive than others. And I just try to, somebody says, what should I do? I have this 2-year-old that's struggling, like, read The Primal Wound, do it now. And other people say, oh, that's just being two. I'm like, maybe. And you still should go read The Primal Wound and just make yourself aware of what your little kid is already going through just because of the separation. So that's what I'm just hoping, that adoptive parents will be more educated. And also it's kind of an ask of all of you to welcome us in, or to not, you don't have to welcome us, just let us in and into these spaces that are for the whole constellation, so we can learn from each other. It's really important.
Greg, may I do a follow-up?
Yes.
In light of all of us, all the three triads have really talked about that. And I'll say, when I talk about four is an understanding of grace and expectations, my expectation is societal idea or mindset of adoption agencies or the whole process. Definitely adoptive parents need to know this before they even are adopting.
Yes.
Birth and natural mothers need to know that there are situations there. I've heard other birth moms, well, I didn't know I can have my own lawyer, because they weren't told things. So many things have been kept secret. As I say, we need to pull the covers off, put that information out there, and let it be known that everyone has a place, Beth. Everyone has a place in talking, because we all come from our own perspectives, and we're here to help each other. Along with, for the adoptee, number one, pre-verbal trauma and grief, birth mother, trauma and grief. Everybody's got trauma and grief. Let's understand that. You cannot get it. That's part of adoption. Trauma and grief. The key is, how do you deal with it? How do you manage it? How you're able to grow your life, live your life, and connect and really have that grace and healing so you can become the best you can be. And we can all do that together. And together we can make society, when I say society, those outside of the adoption or the constellation or whatever. That's why public dialogue like this, when they asked me, did I object, or could I put it on YouTube? I've been yelling from the mountaintop for years, and I will continue to do that. And that's what as many of us who can, and I use the word can, because not everyone is going to be able to do it. I understand that. Not everyone's going to be on a podcast. Not everyone's going to come out public. There are a lot who will come onto the adoption, maybe situations or support groups, and don't say anything. They're not ready. So that's, again, an understanding and expectations of where each individual is. So go as far as you can go yourself. But for those of us who has a voice, we need to continue to have our voice, stretch outside of it, because just as you said, if adoptees are talking to adoptees, birth parents talk to birth parents, birth mothers, we need to talk to everybody in the world. And that's my goal and my mission. So you're going to be hearing some things, because I'm coming out loud and strong to the public.
A great response. I have one final question in this section, which I've called community observations. It's kind of related. It's kind of an offshoot of this, but we've talked about things we'd like to see changed, or that the panel members would like to see maybe changed within each of these respective communities. Are there, within each of these, though, maybe a certain theme or struggle that members of those communities are facing? So if I turn to Linda, I would say, within the adoptee community, do you see a common theme or a struggle that stands out in your mind that kind of represents, this is the feeling that we have in our group?
I think I would have to say that we still know, or what we hear is that people aren't understanding that adoption is trauma, and that even if we've grown up in the happiest of circumstances with our adoptive parents and family, that there's still that severance that happened that changes you neurologically. And it sets you on a course of how you are and how you relate to your world. And when people don't understand that, then it makes the adoptee often feel like they're crazy, there's something wrong with them, they're defective. And it just increases that feeling of low self-worth and the sense of otherness, no genetic mirroring. And I think all of that plays into how we, as an adoptee, go out into the world. And I'm just really thrilled about all the podcasts that are coming out now of a lot of different avenues of, I want to pick on one specifically, is adoptees in the workforce. I thought that was brilliant because it's so, how do we do our life? And so on that podcast, you can see all the things, connect the dots of, I see now why I was in this particular job and why I acted the way I did and the way I maybe distorted when my boss told me that, I wasn't doing this or that. But in my adoptee head, I hear, you want me to leave. You want me to pack my bags and leave right now.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to understand in my own walk that I have a tendency to do that. And so it's helping me get back on track of, okay, what did they really say? And what do I know is truth? And I think that as adoptees, as we keep knowing and learning about not only ourselves, but even, I'm going to talk to Yvonne about this, that I used to blame my birth mom a lot. But now that I've really opened my heart and my ears, I think she was stuck in her trauma, and that's why she wouldn't give me a straight answer. I don't think she had the capacity to give me a straight answer. And I have such huge compassion for her now. And unfortunately, she's passed now. So I can't go back and say, I think I get it now. But we did reunite and we did have moments of exchange, and I'll always be happy for the fact that I did find her, and it was truly like finding a needle in a haystack. But if I could say anything, is the more I open my ears, my heart, my eyes, and live my life in this way, I'm starting to feel less defensive about everything and understand that my adoptive parents, it had very little to do with me, the reason they treated me the way they did. It had very little to do with me. And even birth mom, it had very little to do with me personally of why she felt she had to place me for adoption. So I think wisdom, as long as we keep searching for more and more wisdom and listening to each other and having a heart and like grace that you spoke of, it's just going to do us all the better.
Great answer. Thank you, Linda. So Yvonne, it's back to you about a common struggle or theme you see in your community.
Yes, absolutely. Going back to that shame that people put on birth moms for the fact of getting pregnant without being married. You could have been 14, 15 or whatever. If you got married, everything was okay. But for the fact that you weren't married and you're pregnant, then that just made it that shame on it. So my thing to birth and to natural moms is to walk out of your shame. Walk out of it. Whatever period of time it's been for, is when you had your child, whatever. Walk out of it as best as you can, step by step, when you can. Not putting an expectation, because everyone's different. And I agree with you, Linda. When birth moms have this stuff so deep, they're not able to. They may want to, truly want to, but just can't. I see that about my parents. I really had to go through the part of forgiving them. Yes, I needed their help then. I wanted their help. They ignored me, but that was just part of the family system anyway with that. But understanding they just weren't capable. So when you understand where people are, so I say to birth moms, whoever, walk out of your shame, as well as, yes, you have a right to find or look for your child, or your child have their original birth certificates. Back to adoptees. I testified, my son was born in Virginia. I testified, wrote letters and so forth, and where they got the idea that birth mothers didn't want to be found, I don't know. They pulled it out of the sky, as far as I know. So I know I did not sign nothing to say that, but that was what it was expected to do. So I say to birth moms, stand up for that. Not only does my son not have his original birth certificate, I don't have it. So all of this needs to come out for us. People think everything is up to snuff and whatever, and it's not. And the idea behind, I know we'll probably talk about it a little later with reunion, they think, oh, everything's fine now. You found your son. No, reunion is hard. And number one, the journey is just beginning when you're in reunion. So understanding and having that understanding of that, and you're not going to have it until you do your own work. I tell birth natural mothers all the time, do your work. Do your work. So you're responsible for yourself. Don't put it on your child, the adopted parents. Likewise, we talk about trauma and grief. I understand that adoptive moms who are not able to conceive before they adopted, that's pain that needed to be dealt with beforehand for you to be able to receive a child through adoption and understand. So everybody get a whole circle. You have the triad with a lot of trauma and grief, and all of it is a big mess, but you have to pull it aside like a ball of string. You have to pull it one piece at a time and work it through. That's the process, because it is lifelong.
Thank you. Very good. Well, Beth,
Yeah.
common theme or struggle in the adopted parent community?
I think the biggest struggle that I see in the adoptive parent world is defensiveness. And that underneath that defensiveness is probably grief and guilt. But it's much easier to go into blaming mode. Oh, the birth parent didn't show up again. Or my adopted kid is, you know, addicted and rebellious and trying to make me crazy. You know, it's very easy to make that defensiveness turn toward others and blame them, or to completely be in denial. Oh, this has nothing to do with adoption. What? You know, so it can look a couple of different ways, but it's very difficult to get adoptive parents to come into these kind of circles and really talk deeply about this, because it pulls up so much guilt. And I wish I would have known. I wish I would have done things differently, you know, but you can't go backwards. But I think that's one of the main feelings. And we've had a pretty rough week in adoption world with that the film The Blind Side, and you can see the adoptive parents getting so defensive, and it's really horrible how you know how they've treated him all along, and how they're treating him still. And that's just pretty common, sadly, but that definitely is something that adoptive parents need to take a good hard look at, and look at what's underneath that defensiveness. What is that painful feeling that you're trying to defend so hard?
Conclusion of the community observations, which I put as part one of our panel discussion here. We'll move into part two, which is constellation dialogues. Just a couple questions in this one. And maybe this first one will kind of answer itself. It's really, I'll give you the general question, then I'll turn to each of the panel members to address. And it's, have each of you seen successful examples of good exchanges within the adoption constellation? And what do you think made those effective interactions? So I'll start with Linda.
I would have to just say that I see open ears and open hearts, and a willingness to remain willing to listen to what others have to say, and not being so defensive. I'm still thinking about what Beth said, because it really made me think of fear of scarcity. I think that a lot of people that maybe have a sense of entitlement, and I can't step away from that. That was my experience with my adoptive parents, is that there was this, I was a commodity, I was purchased, and I was supposed to be who they wanted me to be. And so anytime I proved to be an individual, it was in their face that I wasn't who they purchased. And it was also kind of like a spotlight on them of they weren't going to get what they felt entitled to get. So yeah, I'm sorry, Greg, I did a rabbit hole there.
That's okay. Yeah, and it's a question about whether you've seen more effective examples of dialogue within the constellation that you can think of, and what do you think made those effective? And you've mentioned here the openness piece, for example. Any other thoughts on what makes an effective conversation in the constellation?
Well, I do think that we all have to do our research, like Yvonne's saying. You have to do your own interior work, or it's really not going to matter what, even if you are open and talking, you do have to have a little bit of education and research, and have an opinion of to have things to base on to come up with an idea, and that the exchange is just going to be better because you have got some sort of foundation and understanding, and so it's a good conversation that is going to have reciprocity, a good exchange back and forth from all the sides of the constellation.
Yeah, thank you. I completely agree with the reciprocity piece. I think that's what we're seeing here. How about for you, Yvonne? Have you seen examples of it in the constellation that you think are shining examples of how it should be done, or that maybe?
Absolutely. Conversation, as I say, for its dialogue, and with Birth Moms Real Talk, we try to do it at least once. We said once a month. It's been about every other month to have what we have here tonight: adoptee, adopted parents, and and have that conversation and have an honest conversation. And what I've seen successful is when people are challenged doing that dialogue. For example, our last one we did in June, it was before our second anniversary, I think. And that the adoptive mom was a personal friend of mine. And I knew her daughter was adopted. She had just turned 18. She wanted to do the ancestry of DNA. She wanted to meet her parents. And that was June. We had the meeting, but so it must have been about 3 weeks before that. I get urgent texts on a Sunday morning. I typically don't hear from this friend on Sunday morning, that her adoptive daughter had found her aunt in her birth mother's side. Turned out her birth mother had passed away last October. So she's 18. And she was going to talk to her birth aunt, her mother's sister, in 30 minutes. So the adoptive mom was panicking. She was breathless on the phone. What I do? What I do? What I do? Because this birth mother had the attitude, and she said, and she took that, this is my position I'm taking, because the adoptive agency told her that her birth mother was a drug addict and whatever. She's not going up nowhere near her birth mother. That's what she had said to me for years. And I said to her then, you need to test that on whether you want to keep your daughter away from her birth parents if she wants to. So here it was, hitting her in the face and saying, what should she do? Let your daughter meet her family. Well, should I be there? She's 18. If she doesn't want you there, you don't go there. So it was telling her that, and really that was not what she wanted to hear, but that was what she needed to do. So confrontation, well, I should say confrontation, but facing out and really hearing from the other perspective. And her daughter was standing on her ground to say, no, Mom, I don't need you on this call. I just want to talk and learn my family. That's what she wanted to know as an adoptee. So allow them to know that. And likewise, regarding for the birth of first parent with the adoptees, if it's expectations, okay, if you're expecting when you find your child in a reunion, okay, I'm going to have Thanksgiving dinner and Christmas, and we can do, you're making these plans, ask the child what they want. So it's back again about agreement, not necessarily negotiation, but ask the question. So many people assume, and you know what happens to that. Ask the question. Find out what the person wants and do. Because otherwise, that's when you're respecting their opinion. Otherwise, that's control when you try to do it the other way. So conversation, open public conversations, dialogue, and address any issue. You know, I think we had a pre-conversation. I said, let it come up. This is a perfect time to address anything that may come up and have this as a teachable moment.
Thank you. How about for Beth, examples of successful conversations in the constellation, why you think that worked?
Yeah, I think this is an example of one where we're all just peacefully just listening to each other and having a wonderful conversation. I'm appreciating you all so much. And I think that I am just blown away every time an adoptee is willing to just talk to me on the pod, or I've had adoptees come and talk to our APtitude support group in an adoptive parent only space. So imagine a bunch of adoptive parents and one adoptee comes in, they're willing to do that. I hate to say grateful because I know that's like a trigger word for adoptees. So I got to think of a different word. I'm so appreciative and honored when there are adoptees and birth parents too that have come to, you know, kind of walk into that lion's den, and everyone's treated them fine anyway. But I'm sure that that is not taken lightly when they cross over that line like that. And I think that anytime we can talk, you know, I have a bunch of adoptees on the pod. I've had Linda and Greg and Amanda. All three of them have been on the pod in different places, and I'm currently really working hard to bring in more people of color. And, you know, talking about adoption and race is like, oh man, that's a tricky conversation. But I just am like, well, I will just stick my head out, and just, I always tell the person, please tell me if I mess up or if I say something that's hurtful. But I figure, well, I'll just start these conversations. I will talk to the adoptees, I'll talk to the birth parents, I'll talk to everybody who's willing to talk with me, and, you know, talk about these tough things so other people can go, oh, well, I guess you can just ask questions. I guess you can just ask. And what's the worst that can happen? They might say, ouch, that hurt. And then you go, oh, I didn't mean to hurt you, and then fix it and then move on. So I think there's grace on all sides, but a reaching across and being willing to listen and kind of be brave to talk about all of these tough issues with all of the members of the constellation.
That's the second point we had here, constellation dialogue. I took one question out because we kind of answered it organically. So I can move to the third section here, which I'm calling public conversation, which is all about the wider discourse that I think we've all agreed needs to happen here. And as valuable as it is within the constellation, I think we each feel a burden in a sense to bring this into the social sphere to the greatest degree that we can as representatives of our community and collectively as the constellation. And sometimes that's just for awareness sake, to get people to start thinking about things. Sometimes there will be needs, of course, for advocacy, and that's a very specialized topic that we can maybe take up in another panel discussion at some point. But I'd like to hear from each of you what you think is necessary to move the conversation about adoption forward from each of your perspectives in the larger social sense. If I start with Linda, and you can hear that all of these questions are related really all the way through the discussion we've had. We're now building into this wider sphere, but what do you think is necessary for adoptees to take the message that we may have into the social sphere?
And I think I can only answer that from what I've just been walking through for the last 6 years, where I feel I've been coming out of the fog regarding adoption and a lot of other things. Even when I had reunion when I was 24, I was very much in the fog. I just had a lot of zeal to go and find my birth parents, but it was really, I truly was still not at home. But I think that the stronger, more bold, more courageous I've gotten as a person, where if I didn't let my words come out and get them on paper, I felt like I was dying. And I think the more people, and I've heard this from a lot of people of wanting to write their own story, it's just so important. Even if you just put it in a drawer, or you don't have to self-publish, you don't have to publish with, it doesn't matter. It's just getting those words inside you on paper, and it's for your healing and it's for other people's healing. And it's just the ripple effect that it's just going to get, more and more people are going to start telling their stories, getting in touch with how they feel. And then maybe we'll see Hollywood come alongside us and tell the true story from an adoptee's perspective, or from a birth mother's or adoptive. Let's just tell the freaking real story and stop, like you said, let's just take the sheets off it and really see everything for what it is. And I think it's that dualistic thinking, black and white thinking of it's either this or it's that. But if we could try to see that everything's connected and be more non-dualistic in our thinking, and give space for all of it, because it's all connected. Maybe we'd actually, that ripple effect, I hope, is just going to get bigger and bigger and have more effect.
Great.
I definitely agree with you, Linda. And part of it, I said, for whether it's birth moms, adoptees, or adoptive parents, the more we encompass talking about our adoption story in the public and to people we know outside of these rooms, outside of support groups, outside of podcasts. I was at a board meeting this past week. I live in Washington, D.C., and I'm a board member of the United Nations Association. So we're in a board retreat, and I was talking to someone, I think during lunch, and he asked the question, well, you have children? I said, yes, I have an adult son. In fact, there's an interesting story behind that. And I told him my story. So my son is part of my story. So it's like in conversation, whether I'm meeting someone new or whatever, it's just part of the conversation with that. And the more and more we get comfortable to know that it's like, well, now he was my only child, so I never had other children. So he's my only child. So it's like when people, if you have other children, if you talk with you about your raised children, them, and you don't talk about the adopted, whether you're in reunion or not. I talked about my son before I found him. I have a son. I don't know where he is, but I'm going to find him one day. But I talked about that. As well as when I did find my son, we're in reunion, I wrote a personal letter by email and sent it to my circle of people and said, I found my son. This is a very, very emotional time for me. Ask me about my son because I love talking about him. Because otherwise society is sort of like, well, I didn't know you wanted to, he's my son. Don't you want to talk about your son? And so people, when I have conversations, and because I have a few friends that's still timid about asking me, and we may have a conversation and they'll be talking on and on and on about their children. I say, well, you didn't ask me about my son, but he's doing fine. So, like, you have to really encompass it so it doesn't make it something different. So they can understand. And the more and more you talk about it, because sure, this person had shared my story with, I know some people who are adopted, and he goes into his story and whatever, because it happens that way. And that's where we can get the word out. Because when I did find my son, I really gave a testimony in my church of finding my son. It was a large church, over $3,000 or $4,000. 20 people came to me when I came down off the pulpit and said it was either adoptive mom, it was adoptee, or whatever else. I know somebody and whatever else. And now I'm in the process of approaching. We have a counseling ministry at my church, and so I'm approaching them to have a specific support group for the triad, because they're in the room. They're just not talking. They're just not talking. And when they hear about it, then it's like they feel safer. Well, I can approach you and talk to you because you're out. You've outed you. And that's why I tell people, I've outed myself. Yeah.
I really liked it. They're in the room. They're just not talking about it.
Just not talking.
That was really powerful for me. Thank you. How about for Beth?
Yeah.
How we move it forward. Yeah.
For the wider community, I think that I would love to see our healthcare providers and therapists be much more adoption attuned. I think about the dozens of healthcare providers and therapists I drug my son to before I figured out this adoption piece. Not a single one of them said, oh, you're adopted. Huh, maybe that has something to do, that would have been nice. Maybe his pediatrician when he was 2, nothing needed to even happen, but maybe she could have said, you know what? Your son's adopted and he's too little to talk about it now, but maybe you would just want to kind of be aware. And if something comes up, maybe you should get help sooner rather than later. I'm not asking for like the world, but it would be nice if more people that are helping our kids knew more about adoption. And in fact, I had a psychiatrist tell us that he was too little, he didn't remember it, and it doesn't matter. This is a person that went through 8 years of school, like criminy. So there needs to be a lot of work done. And I love talking in these spaces with all the people that all are touched by adoption, but I think it's so important to get this out to the man on the street, the doctors, the teachers, oh my gosh, if they could understand this, the behaviors that they're seeing are not defiance or rebellion or whatever, that is trauma, and they're activated. So getting it to the people that are involved with our kids. Oh, and the rehab addiction spaces, none of them are talking about adoption either, but adopted adults are 43% more likely to have struggled with addiction in their lifetime. So it seems like rehab should kind of know that, but we haven't run into one yet that does. Although there are 2 places for kids that are specifically for adoption and attachment issues that are residential treatment centers. So there are 2 places that I know of. Yeah, yeah, that psychiatrist blew me away, Hannah.
There's a final question I have, and then we'll conclude the panel discussion. And it's more of a personal thing, which is this, that the work each of you do can be emotionally taxing. You get attacked, you get disbelieved, you experience resistance and opposition. And I know that from the 2 of you that I know personally, I know you face that. You could be beleaguered people doing this sort of work. Where do you turn for times of refreshing and resourcefulness and encouragement when that happens? So let me start with Linda. So you face that for sure.
Well, I think I've learned to take that very important pause when something comes up like that, and I have to ask myself, is this a learning opportunity for me to find out what is it that made me feel a certain way of whatever the comment was? And I'm going to bring up one in particular, is that I got a 1-star rating on my first book from one person, but yet I had 45 that were, 5-star. And why did I choose the 1-star to be so concerned with? And I also said, asking myself, is this a true story that I'm telling myself? Because who knows, maybe this person didn't know technology and they just accidentally pushed a 1-star, or they didn't leave a review. So, and I also had to remember my objective for writing my books was not going to be a wide mass appeal. I knew that. My objective was to write my story and to hear my voice, because I never had a voice in my childhood. It was very important. And I achieved that objective. So I have to always remember that I never was out there to be #1 bookseller. It just wasn't the case. I wanted to help myself, and I wanted to help my adoptee community. And through that, I've been helping, just all the different collaborations that I've gotten into, like being on this panel tonight. It's just, my world just kind of really opened up. And who knew that I would be going off into this direction, finding the purpose for my life, really.
Thank you. Well, for Yvonne, where do you turn when it gets to be a lot? And how do you find times of refreshing, I guess I'll call it?
First of all, Linda, continue to own your voice, because you got a right to your voice. All of us have right to our voice. Self-care. And I come back to, and I tell myself, my mantra is put my own gas mask on, air mask on first. When you get into the airplane, what's the first thing? I can't help anybody else unless I am here. I just finished a break from even recording podcasts. My newest episode, beginning of season 3, just launched today because I took time off from May, Mother's Day. May is a tough month for me. I acknowledge that, Mother's Day and so forth. And just a whole day-to-day, and I say day-to-day of reunion, because whether I see my son, talk to my son, we're going through this reunion that we're writing our playbook day by day, and it's emotion. It is emotion. And we talk about the roller coaster. Let's be real clear. I fall off the roller coaster. And when I fall off, I'm going to sit there, lay there for a minute until I can get my breath back or whatever else. And it is okay. And I tell everybody that you need to fall off, just sit down until you're able to get back up or get some help, whatever. Your own self-care to stay focused on knowing who you are and what's your name. That's why I tell birth and natural mothers, the name shame was put on so many moms and they accepted it because that's where they were. Walk out of your shame. I still say that. Walk out of your shame. And I do that. I know who I am. I know my name. I know I am the best person I can be because I work at that. And other people may have their opinion. That's their opinion. It has no reflection on me. No reflection. And I understand what you're saying for us, Linda. But you're thinking one thing, one negative that's going to overshoot all the rest of it. Oh no. Oh no. First of all, I give myself 5 stars every day. I do, whether anybody else gives it to me or not. And I really, I'll say this because I'm very transparent. I don't care what people think. I really don't. I really don't. I can't be thinking about them when my first priority is my son is my first priority and us together. That's it. Forget the rest. You got an opinion, you can state it. I'm not going to listen to it, but you can't. Because I've had, when I started the podcast, it was some ugly stuff going. So delete, become again, delete. Then I send a message, I'm blocking you. I mean, really, I just have no time for that. Have no time.
Thank you. How about for Beth?
Yeah. So a half hour before this event started, I was tagged in a post on Facebook. A writer mentioned me that I was going to be in her book and that I was a podcaster. And somebody said exactly what the world needs to prop up: another expert AP voice, adoptive parent voice. And then the author said, have you ever listened to her podcast? And the person said, why would I want to listen to someone who supports and perpetuates the adoption industry and commodification of children? If they just took 5 seconds to listen to the podcast, they would know that I am absolutely against all of that and pro-adoptee, but people are not willing to listen. So what I've learned is to get a thicker skin. I'm pretty thin-skinned still, but I've learned that that's their problem. That is their problem. They're not even willing to listen for 5 seconds. Then I can't help them. I'm not even going to argue. I'm not even going to go into that space and dig in with them. It's no use. They've made up their mind. So what keeps me going, I do a lot of self-care as well. I'm in therapy. I'm doing EMDR right now to work on my infertility grief and other stuff from my own childhood. And that adoptive parents that were not adoptees themselves, we may have attachment issues as well that might get very activated by our kids' attachment, trigger things. So I'm working on my own stuff, and I do all this to help people like my son. I just want no one else to have the tough stuff that we've had to go through. And if I can get to people a little sooner than I figured it out, if I can find them when they're 7 or 8 or even younger, that that makes me happy. And when my son and I started our podcast way back 2 years ago, I said, Joey, how will we know if we're a success? I'm kind of a numbers person. I like to know. How will I know when we've made it? And he says, Mom, if we just help one person, that's all we need to do. And so I try to keep that in mind and keep my wise son in mind with all the work that I do.
Well, what a marvelous exchange we've had here. I want to express all my appreciation for Linda and Yvonne and Beth, and for Amanda for making this such a fruitful discussion. I've certainly learned from it and appreciate every perspective I've heard. And it takes a lot of vulnerability, it takes a lot of courage to know that this is going to be something people can look at on YouTube pretty soon, on the Fireside Adoptees YouTube channel. And maybe Beth, you'll be able to also post it as well on Unraveling Adoption. So we're excited about that. And we approach it not with trepidation, but with hope for future generations of adoptees as well, that our voices will be heard, that adoptive parents will be better informed, that first parents will be better understood and their loss and their grief acknowledged. And we want to thank everybody who's been in attendance here. We'll end the recording in just a second here and go to our question and answer session. But again, thank you so much for everyone's attendance, for a great and wonderful discussion. And we will certainly continue more discussions in Constellation conversations. Thank you very much and good night.